afternoon. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 5, 4, and 30 seconds.
What? Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? Yes, I sure can. Okay, this is interesting. There go the lights. Oh.
We are here with Rosemary Anderson at the Office of Emergency Services. It is the 29th of August, 2019, and we are here to talk about the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing me into your office.
You're welcome. Thank you for including me.
Of course. Would you start by telling me how long you've lived in Santa Cruz?
I've lived in Santa Cruz since 1975.
Okay, so a couple of years.
Couple of years. 44 to be exact.
And what were you doing during the earthquake? Before, during, after?
So I had just started going back to Cabrillo College and was finishing up one of my last semesters before transferring to a 4-year university. I had a 3-year-old. I was 5 months pregnant. And I was just getting ready to take a final exam at Cabrillo.
Oh.
So I had called and ordered pizza for my neighbors who were going to watch my daughter while I was at Cabrillo. Mm-hmm. And while I was on the phone, the earthquake hit. And so I was in my home in Watsonville, and all of a sudden the whole house started shaking. It started with a jolt. And then the phone was actually attached to the wall with a cord. So I looked out and I could see the refrigerator falling over and all these things, and then I realized, oh, this is a really big one.
Had you lived through an earthquake before?
Very small earthquakes before that, and we had had some precursors to the big one on October 17th, but that was certainly the most significant earthquake I had ever felt. Yeah.
So what was going through your mind? I mean, what did you do?
Well, my daughter was at a neighbor's two doors down, so my first thought was, okay, I got in a doorway, which was the protocol at the time, and I just waited for the shaking to stop. I called my mother right away in New Jersey for 2 reasons. One, that was our emergency plan, was to always call somebody out of state because that's usually the only call you're going to get, and to let her know that I was okay and my daughter was okay. My then husband and my brother were up at the World Series game, and I knew my mom would be watching the game because she's an avid sports fan, and she said she had just seen it on TV. Just heard about the earthquake on TV. So I went down the street and I got my daughter and just made sure that they were okay. It was my neighbor's mom who was watching their 3 little girls, and she was from Hawaii, just arrived that day, and she had lived through many significant earthquakes, but she was purely terrified.
Really?
Mostly because now she's responsible for these 3 little children. Her daughter and her husband were on a business trip in Washington, D.C., so we decided that we would huddle and we'd clean up one house, made it their house, forts for the kids under the table, setting up an area where they would be able, because we lost, well, it was still light then, but we lost power. It was right near a gas main break, so we wound up being without electricity, power, and water for more than 7 days. So it was pretty significant. And then pretty soon you just see the whole neighborhood rallying. Everybody's out of their house, checking on each other. Are you okay? What's going on with your house? We were fortunate, besides the big cleanup, that there was nothing structurally immediately damaged, like chimneys and that type of thing, which was not true for every house in the neighborhood.
Sure.
People wound up just kind of congregating outside and taking stock of, what do we need to be doing? People started barbecuing and sharing food and all those kinds of things, knowing that the food would have gone bad. Once we realized that we weren't going to have any running water, I used our water heater water for our water, and just keeping the girls calm because they were from 6 to 3.
Okay.
So really that was my first experience, was really just about what kinds of things do we need to be doing to get together and just make sure that we were all safe. No cell phones.
Right.
No anything. So if I wasn't near my home, nobody could be calling us. That kind of a thing. I was able to get a hold of my sister locally and my sister-in-law, and they were both safe and said, if you need a place to come, you can come to Watsonville. We've got room, and then everybody could be together. And that's what we wound up doing, is everybody came to one place and we all just stayed together and waiting for news, like what happened.
Yeah. Did you know the significance when it happened?
Interestingly, only from the physical feeling of what it felt like, and then going out and just kind of assessing our neighborhood. There were neighbors who lost chimneys, there were significant cracks in certain houses and that kind of a thing. It was interesting to us how it was somewhat disparate and how it affected some structures and not others.
Right.
And then, like I said, most of the time was really just like, did you feel that? And just this kind of assessing what our own personal situations were.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're listening to the radio. And everything is about the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sitting in Watsonville going, maybe they don't know anything happened here.
Right.
And over the course of really the next couple of days, that was the most significant piece of it, was that it didn't feel like people knew what had happened where we were.
Mm-hmm.
They had that huge roadway that had broken apart on Highway 1.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't get in from 129, so that's when we really realized that people don't know because they couldn't get here to figure out what was going on.
Right.
And then over the course of the days that followed, of just how Watsonville pulled together as community to help each other and to kind of figure out where we were as community, and that was, it just made me feel really good about where I lived, and still does. I still live in Watsonville to this day.
That's great. How did the earthquake impact your life, if it did?
It impacted it in very significant ways. First of all, being pregnant during the earthquake, I was very grateful that I didn't have an infant to care for during that time period, but that wasn't my neighbor across the street's experience. She had a 3-month-old, so it was just very different. Emotionally, I think I've just really understood in a more very personal, visceral way, of the importance of community and neighborhoods. I was fortunate to know my neighbors before the earthquake, but that wasn't true even today of how people relate to their neighbors, how people just really came together, the importance of family, and that we didn't die. We didn't have significant damage to my house, which would have been devastating to us financially and just even as a household. I think it really informed my whole sense of just taking stock of things in a very immediate way, and I had lived through many other disasters in Santa Cruz, including the 1982 floods. So that informed me of what I needed to do to spring into action in terms of you can't be emotional right now. You just have to take care of business and make sure everybody's safe. And that just immediately kicked in. And then after that was just, I think, that emotional relief of, oh, okay, we're okay. And then my brother and my husband at the time were up in San Francisco and waiting for word from them.
Right.
And when were they going to come home? Were they going to be able to get back to us? Those kinds of things. And they made their way back to Santa Cruz County about, it was probably close to midnight or 1 o'clock.
Oh.
And they said as they were traveling down the coast, the most significant thing to them as they were coming over that piece from Davenport into the city of Santa Cruz is that everything was dark. There was no lights, there was no nothing.
Yeah.
And how eerie that was. And then making their way to South County to see how we were, because they had no idea how we were doing. So that part of it was just, and then what's it going to look like? What's the world going to look like? I was going to Cabrillo to take my class. Am I going to finish the semester? What's it going to look like? What does that mean for all of us in the days, months, and even years to come?
Yeah. Were you able to go back to school?
I did, and I
quickly?
finished the semester, and then I had my very final semester that next year, the winter semester, and so that felt really good to finish that. But watching the community recover and all of the things that happened in the subsequent weeks from that, it was a very hot day that day. It was a hot day the next day. All the people who were congregating in Ramsey Park and downtown Watsonville, and nobody wanted to go back inside. So that was really interesting. And then it rained.
There was the weekend after?
Yeah. So just all of these extremes in weathers and how people were affected and the emotional impact of people who did lose their homes and people who lost their lives. My sister and I went down to downtown Santa Cruz because that was such an iconic part of all of our personal and kind of social lives, and just seeing the devastation of Pacific Garden Mall and all of the other things as we're just driving from South County to North County,
Right.
and just understanding the sheer widespread devastation of it and the loss of life. That was really significant as well. Bridges and infrastructure, like how are we going to rebuild from this?
Right.
And Watsonville, interestingly, I felt like we really launched into action almost immediately, again, because we were so severely impacted. There was, I called it an army of Mennonites that came they weren't even called, they just came to see what they could do to help, and they helped rebuild, and they helped clean up messes and all those kinds of things. It was just the help that arrived. The first ever concert, it was Bill Graham had arranged for this concert at Watsonville High School in the grounds there. Santana played, all these really famous people came and played to really bring energy to the community and support. And so that was really cool. My 3-year-old daughter said, "You don't even know how lucky you are that this is your first concert." It was really cool. So those kinds of things, like those little smatterings of memories of just how people rallied around us, this small rural community in the county of Santa Cruz, California, was pretty cool. Yeah.
So clearly the earthquake didn't scare you away because you're still here.
I'm still here.
What was it like to see the rebuilding effort, to live through the earthquake and then see how both Watsonville and Santa Cruz have changed since that moment?
I think because I started, when I first moved to Santa Cruz in 1975, I lived in Santa Cruz proper. I lived in Live Oak first, and then I lived on the west side, and then I lived up in San Lorenzo Valley before I moved out to Watsonville. And I really understood the difference between the North and South County, if you will, and I've always felt that my allegiance really was solidified to South County during that time. I just felt like there was less politic that was involved in the rebuilding and the recovery than there was in Santa Cruz. And it was a little bit depressing to watch at least some of my favorite icons in Santa Cruz literally disappear. The Cooper House was a huge one for me, because when I first moved to Santa Cruz, I would walk the railroad tracks downtown and watch Warmth perform in the courtyard there. One of my second jobs, I called it my vacation fun job, was to work at Morrow's Nut House in the Cooper House, and so I made candy and sold nuts and things to people, tourists that came through, and that building just became like a second home to me. And so when it was determined that they were going to take it down, and the wrecking ball came, and it took them like 5 or 6 tries before it even made a dent in doing it, there was a lot of us who just openly wept and said, well, I think the building's trying to tell you something. It shouldn't be taken down, but it was. So that was very sad to me. And all of my favorite stores and shopkeepers that people knew personally, because that's how the downtown was at that time, were displaced in tents or could never come back to their businesses and those kinds of things. People who lost their lives in buildings downtown. And it seemed like it took forever for them to recover. And in fact, that one lot was fairly recently recovered from that. So I always likened it to kind of a war zone, and I thought it was an unfortunate reflection of politics that people couldn't have come together in a little bit more cohesive way to recover in a quicker fashion. And certainly Watsonville has had its economic challenges, and downtown isn't what it was for a variety of reasons, but they've always been persistent in terms of how they're trying to reinvent that and revigorate it, and it still attracts people to there. So I think that was part of it too, is that there still existed this community connection that I felt downtown lost for me forever after the earthquake.
Do you now take any precautions against earthquakes?
Well, interesting that you say that. So certainly my job as the Emergency Services Manager of Santa Cruz would at least make you think that I am prepared in my personal life. But it was really from that 82 storm that it really brought home to me how important it is to have something with you all the time and to make sure that your house is prepared, and that if you leave your, my whole kind of modus operandi is that when I leave my house, I leave thinking I might not come back that day for a variety of reasons, whether it's weather, my job responsibilities, or roads or something. So I always make sure that I have something in my car that I can survive for at least 3 days: clothes, contacts, glasses, water, power bars, those kinds of things. And the same was true for my home. And then that kind of became our family friend plan, was what do we have together in our earthquake kit at our house? And we all got rolling garbage cans and put stuff in there and really started, and I did that with my 3-year-old, like, okay, so what kinds of things do you think we need in here? And she put in her favorite book and, you know, flashlights and water and things, but more comfort things that I hadn't really been on my radar, but certainly should be part of your kit. Mm-hmm. So that piece of it really was brought home for me, and it certainly is became my passion, not only as a community volunteer, but also through the work that I chose over the course of the next 30 years. Intermittent with that about preparedness, and always just making sure that resiliency in that part of the education stays at the forefront of people's minds. Because I think people have what I've termed disaster amnesia. So it's like, oh, that was 30 years ago. But here you are talking to me and it felt like it was yesterday.
Right.
It was 30 years ago. That was a long time. And so the lessons of that for me have never been lost, and the whole idea of what happened and what could happen, and gratitude, honestly, I know that sounds very Santa Cruz-ish, but it is really true, is that the gratitude of what I have today and where we live, and we're very fortunate to be in an environment that really supports that. If we had to be outside for days, even in the rain, we're going to survive that. We're going to be okay. So we have a lot of really great things that are at our fingertips, that regardless of all the hazards that we have that could potentially impact us, specific to our county, which is just about everything, including tornadoes, that we also have so much beauty and just so much heart in the community that lives here, that I just know that this will always be my home. Yeah.
Doing the work that you do, emergency management, and having lived through significant disasters locally, what were you planning on taking this career trajectory when you were at Cabrillo, or was this sort of you fell into it?
I fell into it.
Fell into it.
Yeah. So after Cabrillo, I went to the University of San Francisco. Okay. And my undergraduate work is in organizational behavior, and my graduate work is in organizational development. So I've always really been interested in organizational structure and how things work, which is really applicable to everything, and it doesn't require a high math degree, is my disclaimer for that. And then I went to work at UC Santa Cruz right after I graduated with my undergraduate. And I had been in social services, working primarily with the developmentally disabled population and doing in-home health care and respite. And when I started working at the university, I was working in the Disabled Student Services office, it was called at the time. So my job was primarily about advocacy for students that either had temporary or permanent physical differences. So it could be anything from a broken leg to you're in a wheelchair, or other kinds of access or functional needs that needed to have some sort of a support, whether you were deaf or blind or etc. And a lot of that advocacy also was hand in hand with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was my job to educate people about what that meant and what access and equity meant in terms of just even physical access or other kinds of accommodations. Mm-hmm. And that has everything to do with safety and about just thinking about preparedness and about resilience, because you have to, if somebody's not thinking about that or advocating at that for you, then you're going to have to do that for yourself. So that was just a big part of my job, the awareness thing. And over the course of 23 years, the last 5 years of my career, I worked as the business continuity planner for the campus, which is all about how do you help departments and divisions prepare for how they would be able to deliver services under any adverse conditions, something other than the optimal thing as they open their door to their office every day or their building. And that led to my work as the deputy emergency manager, and we had a fire department, was a UCSC fire department at the time, and I worked in the fire department, and as the deputy emergency manager was trained to everything that my boss, who was the emergency manager for the campus, was responsible for, and he was a wonderful mentor, and he included me in all the trainings, and that really is what gave me the qualifications to apply for the job as the emergency manager for the county.
Wow.
So that's how I wound up here. Kind of backdoor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Social services to emergency management.
But no
all
less
tied together,
effective.
right?
Yeah.
And it really is all about taking care of people or taking care of community, and it's just in a different aspect of it.
Yeah. That's really cool. What's it like to reflect on your experience 30 years later?
It's really interesting to think, because I sold my house 2 years ago, the house I lived in during the earthquake, and I lived there for 33 years. So that was, as I was packing things up and finding articles from the earthquake and just things that I had saved from that time period that were memorabilia, that newspaper articles and all those kinds of things, the books that were published, and just emails. I even had copies of emails from that time period or shortly afterwards. Yeah. And then I had gone on the hike 5 years ago with Sandy Lydon and Gary Griggs through the Cabrillo Extension, walking to the Epicenter on the 25th anniversary, which was a very interesting, because I had been to Nicene March to the Epicenter before, but walking through and hearing it from a historic and a geologic aspect was just really interesting. And of course the stories, because it's all about the stories that people tell about where they were and what happened, and here we are, and all those kinds of things, and I just love that. So those kinds of things of just thinking back, and how fortunate I am to still live here and to call this home. And when I made my decision about where I was going to move when I was downsizing and thinking about where my next spot would be, and I've lived in some of the most beautiful places in Santa Cruz County, that I decided Watsonville is going to be my forever home. So I moved maybe 3 miles from where I used to live. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
I don't think so. Maybe more that I would really hope that people take this opportunity for the 30th anniversary to reflect on the good that was reflected in each one of us and as a community, not only to ourselves, which I think is the most important part, but really to the world, because certainly people paid attention, mostly because of the World Series, that brought so much media that was already here for the Battle of the Bay and all of those kinds of things, but for really understanding what's possible. And again, it might sound trite, but it was the kindness that people afforded to each other, that there was no sense of entitlement or I'm not going to share, or how that was. And then people really got into that mode of how to really be resilient if this ever happened again, and what were our lessons learned. And I just hope we wouldn't forget that. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I really appreciate it, and I think that the community will too.
Well, thank you.
And I'll let you know when it's ready for public consumption.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think oral history is so important, and especially when it comes to a significant event like that, because as I said, it's something that's influencing us still to this day. It will continue to, and it really isn't a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. Exactly. We hope it's not on the anniversary. Too many fun things
That would be terrible.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.